Hi everyone, my name is Kayla. Welcome back to Kay's Hidden Shelf, where we talk about books. Today, let's go over the books that I read in February, and unfortunately some of the ones that I did not get to. Let's start with the ones that I unfortunately was not able to fit in the short month of February. The first being Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. You guys have already seen this one in the March TBR, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it, but unfortunately, I just did not have enough time to get to it, so I'm hoping to start it this month. The next one I just was not able to fit in was The Emperor's Blades by Brian Stavely, and this was the buddy read that had happened over at the Library of Allenxandria's channel. Now, this one I'm not going to try and read right away. Just based on some of the feedback I had been hearing, the vast majority of people did not enjoy it or it was not what they were expecting. So it's something that I'm going to put on the back burner and try a little bit later on. Let's get into the ones I was able to finish, and the first one being The Winter of the Witch by Katherine Arden. This was the final book in the Winter Night trilogy, and what a finale to this story. We continue on with Vassia and her adventures in this world. The continuation of historical events mixed with fantasy, Katherine Arden still did artfully in this. There was so many moments in this where I did have to put it down and just take a break from purely emotional damage. But yeah, overall, it was a fantastic story. This is actually going to be a trilogy I want to reread. Probably annually at this point, just because there is so much to these books. There are so many layers to our characters, so much in the places and the historical events of it that I just want to go back and read and pick out those parts, get the different perspectives that I've heard. I was also able to take part in the live show discussion at Was Only Evie's channel, and just the talk that we had me seeing different parts and different characters in new lights. I just want to go back and read the whole thing again with those perspectives in mind. It was just a fantastic read. If you have not read the Winter Night trilogy, I highly recommend it. Again, it just has that Neil Gaiman with that dark adult fairy tale vibe. Fantastic, well written, and one of my favorite series so far. I ended up giving it 5 out of 5 stars. The next one that I managed to read in February is not one that I had originally planned, but I had been reading so many darker toned books that I needed something uplifting and short, so I actually ended up picking up The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This is a novella and it's literary fiction, but it was just what I needed. We see the story of an old fisherman who is just had a run of bad luck with his fishing lately. He hasn't been able to catch much of anything. And it's kind of put a strain on his relationship with a young companion that he used to go fishing with, as this young boy's parents want him to be a successful fisherman, and clearly that's just not happening with this older gentleman. He goes out by himself to fish as the younger boy is sent off by his parents to a different fishing boat. And on that day, the old man decides to fish in a different spot, and he ends up catching a large fish that pulls him out to sea. Just seeing the old man's perspectives and attitudes toward his situation, the internal narratives that he has, all of it I found to be very hopeful, inspiring. It was just a nice read, and the writing of it was beautiful. So this was just an artful story, beautifully written, something that actually made me want to read more of Ernest Hemingway, as this is a new author to me. I went off and bought a bunch more books from Ernest Hemingway, and I'm really excited to read more from him, but this was just a nice slice of what I needed, which was a short, inspiring read. I ended up giving The Old Man and the Sea 5 out of 5 stars. I felt like I had to use the rating system for this just because of reviews and how all of that works, but overall, I would say this was more of an experience. That's probably cliche, but that's just how I walked away from reading this book. The next book I managed to finish was Voice of War by Zack Argyle. This is a self-published debut novel, and honestly, this epic fantasy was strong. There were a lot of things that I enjoyed about it, from the story, the magic system, to our characters, The world was interesting, but I would have liked more exploration of it personally. The magic system too had some familiarity to other magic systems that I read in some other fantasy books, but that didn't bug me. I actually really enjoyed it. It was still done in a way that was unique to this story. What worked for this for me was that each of these characters were different age groups and they had different family dynamics. Ultimately, that ended up impacting their choices and reactions to situations differently and just gave them their own unique feels from one another. This did feel more story-driven than character to me anyway, and it sets up for book 2, which is Stones of Light. Now, I've already recorded a spoiler-free review for this video. I'll leave a card or a link in the description where you can find that, but essentially, this was a strong debut novel. There are so many aspects of it that I really enjoyed, and I would highly recommend this for any fantasy lover or someone who's looking to get into fantasy novels. I also ended up reading this on ebook along with the audiobook, and the narrator Adam Goldman did a fantastic job with the characters, with just how well he did in the range and bringing the world to life. Overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. There were a couple areas that did feel clunky, but they didn't impact my experience of this in a negative way. The story from Voice of War caught me up so much that I ended up getting Stones of Light and starting it right away after finishing the first one. And guys, the tone, the pacing, the characters, magic system, all of it gets turned up a notch. It's like Zack Argyle just went all in on this, and everything just gets ramped up, from character work, development, to the world building, the magic system. Our storyline continues to progress in this. And of course, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it just because spoilers for Voice of War. I gave this 5 out of 5. It was a masterful sequel. It just solidified the tone of the world and added strength to any weaknesses that I had found in book 1. I am going to do a non-spoiler review for this one as well, just because, again, I feel like it needs its own time for it. Ultimately, I would highly recommend the Threadlight trilogy, and book 3, which is Bonds of Chaos, should be coming out at some point this summer. I am so excited to continue on with our 3 characters, Chris, Laurel, and Alvarax, and the story that Zack has set up here. The next one here was an advanced reading copy I received via NetGalley from the author, and that is the Frelsarien Battle of Eirbor. Now, this is a sci-fi and fantasy mix, and the premise of this is that on the planet Aeon, war has broken out after 100 years of peace between a couple of countries, and they plead with their gods for help. The gods, in return, send the most unlikely of heroes, which are mortals. And this story, the way it's put out in the synopsis, it sounded like it was something I would enjoy. Unfortunately, there was quite a big aspect to it that just did not work for me, and that was the characters. So the story and the world was really interesting. However, the characters I could not relate to. I found a few of them, almost all of them, to be quite annoying, unfortunately. Just their dialogues, their choices, didn't work for me, sadly. But I can see where there would be room for growth, as this is the first book in a series. It might be a setup for further character development, as there was development of these characters throughout the book. Again, just their dialogue and choices I had a hard time with. So that's my own personal experience of this, and as a result, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. There were aspects that worked for me, such as that story and the world. Those concepts were very interesting, and I liked those, but the characters were a bit more difficult for me to enjoy. The last one I managed to finish is one that is not my typical format of reading, but was a prequel to a series that I had read last year, and that is Rose, which is a prequel to the Bone comics. I don't generally read comics, but when I was introduced to it last year in the main Bone series, I loved it. It was a mix of that old classic comic humor with a serious fantasy storyline. But going into the prequel, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about storyline, for the reason that it gives us a insight into the earlier times of Rose and Briar in their lives and how the main plot starts. Again, I just needed something short and light, and I'd been meaning to read this since last summer, so I'm glad I was finally able to pick it up and be able to go back in with our characters and the world, though the tone of this one was different compared to the Bone series. It just had more of a serious tone without that comic humor to it. We get to see where Rose and Briar start out and where this whole plot line begins, with more exploration of the magic system and the world in and of itself and these characters. It was really nice to get some more information and insight into all of that. Overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The art style was a little inconsistent, but I think it added to the character of it. I would say if you're planning on reading this, the prequel is actually better to read after you've read the main Bone series, as majority of the explanation is in those comics first, with this kind of assuming the reader has already gotten all of that knowledge before starting it. So definitely, if you're planning on reading this, I would say start with the Bone comics and then come back to the prequel. So that's everything I've read last month. There were some unplanned reads. Unfortunately, I didn't get to some of these. I'll say chaos happened, but it was a great month overall. What did you guys read last month? I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment down below. And as always, thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.